the honor to ask another extraordinary personality who dedicated her life not only fighting for women's rights, but fighting for human rights, and former anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, former Minister of Health under President Mandela, former Minister of Foreign Affairs under Presidents Mbeki and Moland, the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Ms. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, to take the floor.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, President of Liberia, Your Excellency, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Ms. Portia Simpson, Excellencies, Prime Ministers, Ministers, Honorable Members of Parliament, of course, organizers of this historic event. I'm honored to address this landmark annual summit of the Women in Parliament's Global Forum, and our appreciation goes to the European Union Parliament for hosting and organizing this forum this year. As has been mentioned, we are also celebrating the anniversary of 120 years of women's suffrage with our New Zealand sisters, who became the first in the world to give women the vote and to vote. This anniversary is not only their celebration, but it has to be a global celebration, including the 9,723 women parliamentarians who are in the driving force behind this forum. Your theme for this year's Global Forum speaks to the role of women in the advancement of society. The struggles of the early suffrage and women's movements were not only about women's rights to vote or to be elected, but about the betterment of society as a whole. In the words of Emmeline Pankhurst, who explained in 1913, I quote, "We are women fighting for a great idea, that we wish the betterment of the human race, and that we believe this betterment is coming through the emancipation and upliftment of women," close quote. It was this wish for the betterment of the human race that saw the First World Conference of Women in Mexico reminding the world that in subscribing to the Charter, the peoples of the United Nations undertook specific commitments to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. And 20 years later, in Beijing, the women declared that they advance the goals of equality, development, and peace for all women everywhere in the interest of all humanity. So women today constitute 21.3% of the world's parliamentarians. Of course, as has been said, Rwanda leading all of us with over 60%. In 46 countries across the world, women account for more than a quarter of all MPs. I'm also proud to say that 14 of those countries are in Africa. For Africa, this progress according to Femme Afrique Solidarité, is mainly as a result of two factors, and we can also add a third one. That is women's activism for equal representation and the introduction of quotas. Quotas have seen to women's representation on the continent evolve from 14% in 1992 to 30% by 2012, with women making up more than half of the global population, yet holding an average of 15% political power and 21% inclusion in parliaments. The African continent stands out as an example of quota success and women-led activism. And I think quotas sometimes are misunderstood. People think that quotas mean something else other than merit. All that quotas do is to focus the mind to find the women of merit to take the position. However, the fact that only 2 countries globally have 50% women in parliament means that this struggle for equal representation is far from over. Excellencies, honorable members of parliament, ladies and gentlemen, the Beijing Platform of Action identified 12 critical areas which the women's movement has struggled for in the quest for better humanity and a better world. These critical areas include women and poverty, education and training, health, violence against women, women in armed conflict, women and the economy, in power and decision-making, women, human rights, institutional mechanisms, the media, environment, and the girl child. On all these areas, we're making advances through policy, legal and institutional means, through advocacy, activism and mobilization, and through the voices and actions of women in parliament, government, business, in the judiciary and civil society. But at the same time, as our world changes at a faster pace than ever before, we are confronted by new challenges and by old challenges in new forms. Women account for 70% of the world's poor. And if they stay poor, will add to the cycle of intergenerational poverty. I'd like to quote Mary Hawkinsworth in her 2006 book on globalization. And she makes example of how macroeconomic policy, the rollback of the state in societal services, and the shift away from human security contributes towards this cycle of poverty. I quote, she says, "The reduction in the number of state employees affects women disproportionately as they tend to be the ones working in social welfare agencies, schools, and hospitals. At the same time, the parts of the state that are not negatively affected by privatization tend to be male-dominated: police, military, commerce, and finance. In this sense, structural adjustment policies contributed to a regenderizing of the state on the basis of male privilege. Additionally, the loss of jobs in the formal or formally contracted and paid economy tends to push women into the informal sector with low pay and no recognition. Sometimes people talk about the informal sector and the involvement of women in very romantic terms. The women are there, it's a harsh place to be. All women would like to be in the formal sector, but the conditions are such that they are in the informal sector. And she draws attention to women and migration today. And she says, some 60 million women, drawn predominantly from poor nations, constitute a mobile labor force, crisscrossing the globe in search of a livelihood. Certain migratory circuits have been well mapped. South Asia to the Middle East, former Soviet states to Western Europe, Mexico and Central America to Canada and the United States, and Africa to Europe. These migrants are usually employed as domestic workers, care workers, or even sex workers because of what is called the care deficit. With the increase of women in the workforce in richer countries, someone else has to take on the care they can no longer perform. This care deficit is the pull factor that attracts migrant women to core countries. At the same time, the care deficit exists because, as women took on jobs outside the house, men have not increased their participation in housework. On average, a woman still has to spend 15 hours more than a male partner on housework, not counting childcare. In this sense, the availability of migrant women has not only allowed women in wealthier countries to join the workforce, they have already done that for both personal and economic reasons, but it has allowed men not to take on their share of household work. And as our sister, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, reminded us yesterday, we also face the scourge of human trafficking, what she correctly calls slavery by the back door. These disproportionate and unpaid domestic burdens that women continue to carry greater impacts on their time availability for productive or paid work. Women and work certainly is nothing new, as the quote illustrates. The workforce is newly central to women's lives. But of course, women have always worked. They worked in the fields, in the gardens, in the homes. They looked after children, nursed the sick, prepared food, sometimes scratching from very meager resources. They sewed and mended clothes. They fetched the water from the rivers. They looked for firewood, and they worked their fingers to the bone, as the saying went. But of course, as women, more and more women enter the labor market in the formal and informal sectors, but also in atypical work, in especially the services sector, we must pay greater attention to workers' rights and conditions, to social policy, public transport, including affordable childcare for working and other women and parents. In addition, and especially in developing countries, of course we have to invest in infrastructure, but especially in bringing clean water to the home, sanitation, affordable energy, because all these are chores that are done by women. If energy is not available, it's the women who go and fetch the wood. If water is not available, there is no man who cares about where the water comes from. All they say is, I want a cup of tea, I want to bath. They don't care how we have warmed that, we have boiled that water. So as women parliamentarians, we must ensure that the policies and the laws we pass free women from these chores and make sure that they have access to water, to energy, so that they can go to productive work, and so that their children also do not have to suffer the diarrheal diseases that they get from having to get water from rivers. In addition, and especially looking at the Millennium Development Goals, we must focus on the education of girls without neglecting the education of boys. And in Africa, male-female primary education completion ratios were achieved in 10 countries by 2012, and 21 African countries have achieved parity in the ratio of progression to secondary school. And since educating a woman still means educating a generation, contributing to healthier families and communities and to productivity, we do need a bigger push on access to education and training for girls and boys, of course. This should include expanding access to higher and vocational education and training, to science and technology, research and innovation. More broadly, in Africa, we talk about the need for a skills revolution to give our young people and women a greater stake in the future. We have also advanced in terms of health issues, including women's reproductive rights, reducing maternal and child mortality, the burden of HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria, but we still need to do more. However, we do need to pay attention to address the glaring inequalities of a world that can feed everyone. Our world can feed everyone, and yet children still die of malnutrition and go without meals. In particular, in the developing world and Africa, we must empower women in rural areas to play a greater role in agricultural production and agro-processing, since they constitute the majority of workers in agriculture. And of course, honorable members, the first waves of global, regional, and national feminists and women's movement have seen advances in terms of greater awareness of women and gender issues, reflected in policy and legal reforms. At the same time, globalization has added new dimensions, greater inequality within and across countries and regions, and there's been a backlash against some of the advances we've made. More fundamentally, despite increasing labor market participation of women, very little has changed in terms of patriarchal relations of production and reproduction. All countries across the globe report widespread feminization of poverty, inequality and persistent gender disparities in income, in economic participation and ownership, to the extent that Norway had to introduce forced quotas for company boards. The Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Shinzo Abe, who I would say, like President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, said there are men who are doing their best to level the playing field, and we call them progressive men, and we must work with them. And I just want to quote what Mr. Shinzo Abe said. He says we must talk about womenomics. And he says that the more women's advancement in society is promoted, the higher the growth and development rates and overall well-being of society. So we spoke earlier about some of what is needed to increase women's participation in the economy, and I know there is a panel that's going to deal with that, so I won't go much into detail. But the first issue in this regard is that women are the majority of the poor in the world. So we must therefore make sure that in the forefront of the fight to eradicate poverty, we put women at that center of poverty eradication post-2015. Because if we don't eradicate poverty amongst women, we will never make the necessary impact in dealing with eradication of poverty. And I also want to just say that as women, we cannot talk about eradicating extreme poverty. We just don't want poverty, period. We don't want to be poor, but not extremely poor. So we must put post-2015, assist our sisters who are in the committees to fight that we get eradication of poverty. Secondly, in Africa, we would like to build shared prosperity, and we therefore would like to industrialize, beneficiate, and add value to natural resources. And of course, we also want to bring more and more women entrepreneurs. For Africa, more than over 50% of self-employed are women. But the challenge, according to the World Bank study, is not helping more women becoming entrepreneurs where they are already very active, but rather to enable them to shift from being in the lower informal sector to being in the higher normal sector of business. And we're mentioning all these things because women parliamentarians have a big responsibility within Parliament to make sure that those policies are in place. And I cannot conclude without referring to women leadership in the home. We remain responsible for the socialization of the next generation of boys and girls. And it is therefore important for us to socialize boys and girls in the way we would like to see them as adults. Because adults can only bring back to society what society gave to them as children. So it's very important that we begin shifting how we socialize boys and girls. If we want a world of equality, it must start with socializing our boys and girls. And of course, we must socialize them in a way that they must be equal, they must reach their full potential, and they must be committed to equality and the well-being of the human race and our planet. But women in positions of power in politics, government, parliament, business, civil society also have the responsibility to advocate for greater inclusion and to advocate for a safe, more peaceful, more just, more sustainable, and more prosperous world for both men and women. Sometimes we've seen how women make it, but they make it in a man's world, and they remain in that man's world without changing that world to be a woman and to be a human world, so that more and more women can find it easy to advance. And in our part of the world, we say, if you climb the ladder as the woman, don't push the ladder when you get to the top. Leave it for other women to climb. And of course, as women, parliamentarians and women in different positions, we should act as role models for both young girls and young boys. And I would like to just end by saying Whatever advances we have achieved, we owe it to past generations. We must not forget that. Past generation of women fighters, but we have to make sure that we bequeath future generations with a better world than the one we live in. So that's our responsibility. And I think I'd like just to remember Wangari Maathai, who said, in her usual nonsense manner, women are responsible for their children. They cannot sit back, waste time, and see them starve. And that's the responsibility we have. Thank you.